A dusty, cracked brass altimeter sat in a cardboard box marked with a neon pink $40 sticker. To a stressed mother, it was worthless clutter. To the grinning dealer who bought it, it was a jackpot. But when 82-year-old veteran Albert saw the empty table, his heart stopped. The secret was gone. The late August heat lay over the small town of Oak Haven like a suffocating blanket. In the driveway of a fading two-story colonial 38-year-old, Diane rubbed her temples, leaving a smudge of attic dust across her forehead. The yard sale had been going on since 7 in the morning, and the meager pile of crumpled dollar bills in her cash box felt like a cruel joke against the towering stack of final notice medical bills sitting on her kitchen counter. Her father, Albert Pendleton, was asleep inside. At 82, the former military intelligence officer was a shadow of the formidable man he used to be. A recent stroke had left him partially weakened, forcing him to move into Diane's spare bedroom. Between his physical therapy, her teenage son, Leon's upcoming college tuition, and a mortgage that seemed to grow teeth every month, Diane was drowning. "Mum, nobody wants this stuff," Leon complained, wiping sweat from his neck as he dragged another cardboard box from the garage. "It's literally just broken lamps and Grandpa's old junk." "Just put it on the folding table, Leon." Diane snapped her patience worn paper thin. "If we make $200 today, that covers the electric bill." "Every dollar counts." Leon sighed heavily, upending the box onto a plastic-covered table. A cloud of ancient dust plumed into the humid air. Out tumbled a collection of rusted tools, some moth-eaten wool blankets, and a heavy, dark, olive-green canvas pouch secured with a thick leather strap. The leather was so dry it was flaking apart. Diane walked over her curiosity, momentarily cutting through her exhaustion. She unbuckled the strap, the rusted brass hardware biting into her thumb. Inside the pouch was a strange, heavy metal instrument. It was roughly the size of a cantaloupe, made of heavily tarnished brass and blackened steel. The glass face was cracked in a jagged spiderweb pattern, obscuring a dial covered in faded phosphorescent numbers and strange foreign text. It looked like an altimeter or some sort of pressure gauge from a very old aircraft. "What is that?" Leon asked, peering over her shoulder. "I don't know," Diane murmured, turning the heavy object over in her hands. It weighed easily 10 pounds, probably some old war souvenir your grandfather picked up. "You know he never threw anything away." Diane remembered her father's time in the service vaguely. He rarely spoke of it. He had served in the late 1960s, stationed primarily in West Germany, during the height of the Cold War. To Diane, his military past was just a collection of silent stairs and locked footlockers in the basement. She set the heavy brass instrument on the table and slapped a neon pink sticker on it. She grabbed a black Sharpie. How much for old broken metal, she thought. She scribbled $40 on the sticker. For the next 2 hours, the yard sale dragged on. Neighbors picked through old paperback books and mismatched silverware. Diane was busy haggling over a set of porcelain teacups when a rusted white panel van pulled up to the curb. A man stepped out. He was tall, thin, and moved with a restless, predatory energy. He wore a faded polo shirt, wire-rimmed glasses, and a cheap Panama hat. His name was Theodore Griffith, though he rarely gave his real name at these suburban scavengers. Theodore was a picker, a bottom feeder in the antique world who scoured estate sales and yard sales, looking for items to flip at high-end auction houses. Theodore bypassed the clothes and books entirely, his eyes scanning the tables with clinical precision. He stopped dead in front of the table, holding the canvas pouch and the brass instrument. From across the driveway, Diane watched him pick it up. Theodore's hands were remarkably steady, but if Diane had been paying closer attention, she would have noticed his knuckles turn white as he gripped the heavy brass casing. He tilted it, inspecting the underside. His eyes darted to the cracked glass, then to a tiny, almost invisible stamp near the base, a microscopic eagle clutching a gear accompanied by a serial number. It wasn't an altimeter. It was a World War II-era Kriegsmarine naval chronometer, a highly restricted piece of navigation equipment. But more importantly, Theodore noticed something else. The backing plate of the instrument wasn't flush. There were tiny, non-standard screws holding a secondary compartment in place, a modification that didn't belong on a standard military chronometer. Theodore carefully set the instrument down, adjusting his hat to hide the sudden rush of adrenaline. He casually strolled over to Diane, holding a cracked ceramic vase in one hand and the brass instrument in the other. "Hot day for a sale," Theodore said, flashing a practiced, easy smile. "You've got a lot of interesting items here." "Thank you," Diane said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "See anything you like?" "Well," Theodore chuckled, holding up the vase. "My wife likes these ugly little pots. And this heavy thing?" He casually hefted the chronometer. "Looks like a good paperweight for my garage workbench. You've got $40 on it. It's pretty banged up, and the glass is shattered. I'll give you $20 for the pair." Diane hesitated. The brass thing was heavy. It felt like it should be worth more, but it was broken dirty and taking up space. More importantly, $20 was cash in hand right now. "30, Diane countered, trying to sound firm. "The metal alone has to be worth something." Theodore sighed, doing a masterful job of feigning reluctance. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracted a $20 and a $10 bill, and handed them to her. "All right, you drive a hard bargain." "30 it is." "Sold," Diane said, relief washing over her. She took the cash, smoothing the bills between her fingers. Theodore didn't wait around. He didn't ask for a bag. He tucked the heavy brass instrument under his arm, gave a polite nod, and walked briskly back to his white van. Diane watched him pull away, feeling a tiny spark of victory. She had just made $30 on a piece of literal garbage. Inside the house, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway echoed through the quiet rooms. Albert Pendleton opened his eyes. The afternoon sun was slicing through the blinds, casting long, dusty shadows across his bedspread. His right arm felt stiff, a lingering reminder of the stroke, but his mind, sharpened by decades of intelligence work, was perfectly clear. He went through his daily routine, slowly sitting up, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed and reaching for his aluminum cane. He could hear the faint murmur of voices outside. Diane's yard sale. Albert shuffled out of his room and made his way to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, leaning heavily on the counter. He gazed out the window overlooking the driveway. The tables were mostly bare now. Diane was folding up empty boxes, and Leon was dragging the unsold remnants back toward the garage. Albert's eyes drifted over the piles. He recognized the old lawnmower, the stack of records, the rusted tools. Then his gaze locked onto a familiar empty canvas pouch resting at the end of the folding table. The thick, dry, rotted leather strap was unbuckled. The glass of water slipped from Albert's hand. It shattered against the linoleum floor, sending water and shards of glass everywhere. But Albert didn't look down. His breath hitched in his chest. A sudden paralyzing cold washed over him, completely neutralizing the oppressive August heat. No, she wouldn't have. Ignoring the glass crunching beneath his slippers, Albert moved faster than he had in months. He practically threw himself out the front door, his cane striking the concrete porch with loud, erratic thuds. Diane Albert's voice cracked like a whip. It wasn't the frail, trembling voice of an 82-year-old stroke victim. It was the voice of Captain Pendleton. Diane jumped, dropping a box of paperbacks. "Dad, what's wrong? You shouldn't be out here without your brace." Albert moved down the porch steps, his eyes wide and fixed on the empty canvas pouch. He pointed a shaking finger at the table. "Where is it?" he demanded, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Where is the brass casing the gauge that was in that pouch?" Diane blinked, thoroughly confused by his sudden panic. Dad calmed down. "It was just sitting in a box in the garage. It was completely broken. The glass was shattered. I asked you where it is." Diane Albert roared, causing Leon to stop in his tracks by the garage door. "I sold it," Diane said, defensively crossing her arms. "A guy came by about 20 minutes ago. He bought it for a paperweight. I got $30 for it and a vase." "Dad, it was junk." Albert stopped, cold. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, translucent grey. He swayed slightly, leaning all his weight onto his cane. He closed his eyes, and for a terrifying second, Diane thought he was having another stroke. "Dad!" She stepped forward, reaching out to support his arm. "Dad, what is it? I'm sorry, I didn't know it meant something to you." It looked like trash. Albert opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of the gentle, cloudy look of old age. They were sharp, terrified, and burning with an intensity Diane had never seen. That trash. Albert whispered, his voice, trembling with a mixture of rage and profound despair, was the only thing keeping this family safe. Diane froze. "What are you talking about, safe? From what?" "It was just a broken altimeter." "It wasn't an altimeter." Albert rasped, looking down the street where the van had disappeared. It was a modified housing, and inside the backing plate. He swallowed hard, the memories of Berlin in 1968, violently pulling him backward in time. The rain-slicked streets, the metallic smell of blood in the back of the safe house, the dying breath of a Soviet defector who had handed him a small, heavy, oiled silk packet. Inside, Albert continued his voice, dropping to a near whisper, were 2 uncut, unregistered diamonds worth over $2 million. And a ledger. The silence that fell over the driveway was absolute. Even the cicadas in the nearby oak trees seemed to stop buzzing. Leon dropped the extension cord he was holding. $2 million, Grandpa. Are you crazy?" Diane said, her voice shaking with disbelief and sudden crushing terror. "You had $2 million in a broken piece of metal in the garage. We are about to lose this house, Dad." "Why wouldn't you tell me? Because of the ledger?" Albert snapped, suddenly moving toward the street. "The men looking for those names didn't stop looking when the Berlin Wall fell, Diane. I hid it because spending it meant exposing us. I was waiting until I died, and you could claim it was an inheritance from an unknown relative. I had it all arranged with a lawyer." Diane felt her knees go weak. $30. She had traded generational wealth and her father's darkest secret for $30 to pay a fraction of an electric bill. The man who bought it, Albert turned to her, gripping her shoulders with surprising strength. What did he look like? What was he driving? He had a white van. Leon stammered, stepping forward. A white Ford panel van, rusted around the wheel wells, and I saw the license plate. It had one of those dealer frames on it. It said, River City Antiques. Albert's eyes narrowed. The shock was fading, replaced by the cold, calculating instinct that had kept him alive half a century ago. The picker didn't know what was inside, not yet. He just saw a valuable antique. If he tried to clean it or restore it, he would find the modified backing plate. Once he opened it, everything would change. "Get the car keys," Diane Albert commanded, his voice dead serious. "We're going to River City." The drive to the neighboring town of River City was a suffocating, silent blur. Diane's hands gripped the steering wheel of her battered Honda sedan so tightly her knuckles were stark white. In the passenger seat, Albert sat rigidly upright. The tremor in his right hand had completely vanished, replaced by a terrifying stillness. He stared straight through the windshield, his mind running through threat assessments, tactical variables, and worst-case scenarios he hadn't touched in 4 decades. In the back seat, Leon watched his grandfather with wide eyes. The frail, quiet old man who spent his afternoons doing crossword puzzles was gone. In his place sat a cold, calculating stranger who radiated an aura of absolute command. "Take the interstate," Albert ordered, his voice clipped and dry. "He's a picker. He's going to take it straight to his shop to evaluate it before he lists it for auction. If he opens the backing plate and sees what's inside, he's going to run, or he's going to call someone. We have a 30-minute window." "Dad, I'm going 80. Diane said, her voice shaking. "What if he calls the police I legally sold it to him? He owns it." "If he looks at that ledger, the police are the least of his worries and ours," Albert replied grimly. "Just drive." 10 miles away, Theodore Griffith pulled his rusted white van into the gravel alleyway behind his shop, Griffith Estate Recoveries. The shop was a chaotic warren of stacked chairs, dusty chandeliers and glass display cases filled with pocket watches and military memorabilia. Theodore locked the deadbolt behind him and walked straight to his heavy oak workbench in the back room. He switched on an intense articulated halogen lamp, dragging the heavy brass chronometer into the pool of bright white light. Up close, away from the glaring sun of the yard sale, it was a magnificent piece, even with the shattered glass. Theodore pulled a jeweler's loop from his shirt pocket and wedged it into his right eye. He traced the engraved eagle and the faint swastika that had been partially filed off a common practice for captured German equipment. But his attention kept drifting back to the weight. It was easily 3 pounds heavier than a standard marine chronometer should be. He flipped the heavy brass cylinder over. There it was, the backing plate. It wasn't sealed with the standard heavy-duty naval rivets. It was held in place by 4 microscopic flathead security screws. They were flush, perfectly machined, and completely out of place for a 1940s instrument. Theodore felt a bead of sweat trickle down his ribs. Pickers lived for this. The hidden compartment, the secret stash. He reached into his drawer, pulled out a set of precision gunsmithing screwdrivers, and found the exact match. It took 5 minutes to break the seal of 50 years of grime and oxidation. With a sharp crack, the 4th screw gave way. Theodore pried the heavy brass plate upward. Instead of exposed gears and clockwork, there was a hollow cavity. Tucked neatly inside, wrapped in layers of heavy yellowed oiled silk, was a rectangular package. Theodore's mouth went dry. He carefully lifted the package out. It was shockingly heavy for its size. He set the brass casing aside and placed the silk bundle under the halogen lamp. With trembling fingers, he untied the thin, rotted twine, holding it together, and peeled back the stiff layers of fabric. First came a small black leather-bound notebook. It was no larger than a deck of cards, the pages filled with microscopic handwritten Cyrillic text strings of numbers and corresponding bank routing codes from Zurich, Grand Cayman, and London. Theodore pushed the book aside, his eyes locking onto the second item. It was a small velvet pouch. He loosened the drawstrings and tipped it onto the black felt mat of his workbench. 2 stones tumbled out, catching the halogen light and fracturing it into a blinding, prismatic explosion of color. They were diamonds, but they weren't polished, perfectly cut jewelry stones. They were massive, raw, uncut octahedral crystals, each the size of a large marble. Theodore wasn't a gemologist, but he knew enough about estate jewelry to know that uncut stones of this flawless clarity and sheer size were museum-grade. They were illegal to possess without proper Kimberley process certification in the modern era. But these were clearly old. Very old. "Oh my God," Theodore breathed, leaning back in his stool, his hands running through his thinning hair. "I hit the lottery." He reached for his phone. He had a contact in Chicago, a man who dealt in unconventional antiquities and undocumented assets. A fence. Before he could dial the first number, the heavy bell above the front door of his shop jingled violently. "We're closed," Theodore shouted instinctively, throwing a dirty rag over the diamonds and the ledger. Heavy, uneven footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor of the main showroom. It wasn't the casual shuffle of a browser. It was a deliberate marching approach. Theodore slid off his stool, grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from the nearby shelf just in case. He stepped out of the back room and into the dimly lit shop. Standing in the aisle, flanked by his anxious-looking daughter and teenage grandson, was the old man from the house. But the man leaning on the aluminum cane wasn't looking at the antique furniture. His cold, pale blue eyes were locked directly onto Theodore. "Mr. Griffith, I presume," Albert said, his voice cutting through the dusty air like a scalpel. Theodore swallowed hard, trying to project confidence. "Look, buddy, the yard sale is over. All sales are final. You can't just barge into my shop." "I am not here for a refund," Albert said, taking a slow, agonizing step forward, planting his cane with authority. "I am here for the property my daughter mistakenly sold you. The property inside the brass casing." Theodore's grip tightened on the candlestick. "I don't know what you're talking about. I bought a broken altimeter. It's mine." Albert's eyes flicked to the back room, noting the bright light spilling through the doorway. "You've opened it. I can see it on your face, Theodore. You're sweating. Your pupils are dilated. You saw the stones and you saw the book. And right now, you are calculating how fast you can sell them and disappear." "Get out of my store before I call the cops," Theodore warned, though his voice lacked conviction. "Call them." Albert challenged, not moving an inch. "Let them confiscate $2 million in unregistered blood market diamonds. But the police are the least of your concerns right now. It's the ledger you need to worry about." Theodore hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen of his smartphone. "What ledger? It's just a bunch of Russian gibberish and old bank accounts. The Soviet Union is dead, old man. Nobody cares." Albert let out a low, humorless laugh that made the hairs on the back of Diane's neck stand up. "The Soviet Union is dead," Albert agreed, taking another step closer, closing the distance between them. "But the men who looted its treasury before it collapsed are very much alive. Those names in that book, they aren't dead communists, Theodore. They are the founding fathers of the modern Solntsevskaya Bratva, the most ruthless organized crime syndicate on the planet. That ledger contains the original routing numbers for the slush funds they used to build their empires in the West." Theodore blinked, the color slowly draining from his face. "I was a military intelligence operative stationed in West Berlin," Albert continued, his voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper. "A defector traded me that casing in exchange for asylum. He was murdered 3 hours later. I hid the casing because those men were hunting it. They are still hunting it. If you try to sell those diamonds, the buyers will recognize the specific Ural mountain cut. Word will get out, and within 48 hours men who do not ask questions and do not leave witnesses will pay a visit to this little antique shop." Theodore looked at the old man, then at the terrified daughter and grandson behind him. Albert wasn't bluffing. The sheer weight of history and violence in the old man's eyes was impossible to fake. "You're lying," Theodore whispered, but his hand was shaking so badly he dropped the candlestick. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. "Am I?" Albert asked softly. "Take the diamonds, Theodore. Make your call to Chicago or New York. But know that the moment you do, you are a dead man. They will peel you like a grape to get that ledger back, or—" Albert reached into his pocket and pulled out the $30 in crumpled bills Diane had given him in the car. He tossed them onto a nearby glass display case. "You can take your refund hand over the silk pouch, and we walk out of here. You go back to flipping teacups, and you live to see tomorrow." The silence in the antique shop was deafening. The only sound was the ticking of a dozen antique clocks on the walls, counting down the seconds. Diane held her breath, praying the man would listen. Leon stared at his grandfather, as if looking at a superhero who had just taken off his disguise. Theodore looked at the $30. He looked back toward his workshop, where $2 million sat, hidden under a dirty rag. Greed warred with self-preservation in his eyes, but the cold, unflinching stare of the old veteran broke him. He had seen enough mob movies to know what happened to pawns who got caught in the crossfire of international syndicates. Without a word, Theodore turned, walked into the back room, and returned 30 seconds later. He placed the oiled silk package, re-tied with its rotted twine, into Albert's waiting hand. He then set the heavy, empty brass chronometer casing on the counter. "Take it," Theodore croaked, his voice barely working. "Take it and get out." Albert slipped the silk pouch deep into his coat pocket. He picked up the brass casing and handed it to Leon. "Thank you for your business, Mr. Griffith," Albert said politely. He turned on his heel, his posture impeccable, despite the cane, and walked toward the door. Diane and Leon quickly followed, practically bolting out into the humid afternoon air. When they got back into the Honda, the silence returned, but this time it was thick with relief and awe. Diane slumped against the steering wheel, letting out a long, shaky exhale. "Dad!" she whispered, looking at him in the passenger seat. "Was that true? Are we in danger?" Albert looked at the silk pouch in his hands, tracing the outline of the stones through the fabric. He finally turned to his daughter, and the hard military exterior softened, revealing the loving father underneath. "The ledger is real," Albert said quietly, "but the men hunting it died in a prison in Moscow 20 years ago. The accounts have been frozen since 1995. There's no mob coming for us." Leon's jaw dropped. "You bluffed him. Grandpa, you totally played him." Albert offered a faint, sly smile. "In my line of work, Leon, a good bluff is better than a loaded weapon." Diane started the engine, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her chest. "But the diamonds... Dad, what do we do now? We can't just keep them in the garage." "No, we can't," Albert agreed, slipping the pouch back into his coat. "When we get home, I'm making a phone call to an old contact of mine in Geneva, an independent broker. It will take a few weeks to clear the paperwork and legitimize the find as a recovered family heirloom. But they will sell safely." He reached over and patted Diane's trembling hand. "The medical bills, the mortgage, Leon's college. It's all handled, sweetheart. The war is finally over." As Diane pulled the car out of the alleyway and headed back toward Oakhaven, the oppressive August heat didn't feel so heavy anymore. The shadows of the past had finally been brought into the light, securing a future they had thought was completely lost. If you were glued to your screen during this intense story of hidden secrets and family survival, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this thrilling twist with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss another incredible real-life story. What would you have done with the diamonds? Let me know in the comments below. Stay tuned for more.